Welcome to Open Minds Magazine. In this new UFO magazine show, we'll be focusing on the mystery posed by unidentified flying objects in the hope to gain a better understanding of this phenomenon and how the government, including the military and the public, react to it. Perhaps the most thorough examination into the UFO issue was conducted by the U.S. Air Force. They began their investigation in 1948. It was called Project Sign, then changed its name to Project Grudge, and finally changed its name once again to Project Blue Book. As for their findings, the Air Force states, as a result of these investigations and studies and experience gained from investigating UFO reports since 1948, the conclusion of Project Blue Book are: UFOs are not a threat to national security. No evidence exists of scientific knowledge beyond our own. No evidence indicates extraterrestrial vehicles. However, upon closer examination of the thousands of files released regarding the Blue Book investigation, it becomes apparent the Air Force's conclusions were not shared by everyone involved in the investigation, and that some truly fascinating cases remain unsolved.
Well, officially, there's 701 cases that were listed as unknown. Reality is it's probably higher than that, and they kind of fabricated some answers just to make it fit because they didn't want to have the unknowns. These are really very significant. We anticipate in any UFO investigation that a substantial number, probably well over 90%, are going to be explained by various phenomena or unidentified aircraft that later become identified. But given, even during that period, it was a very significant number because some of them just defy all rational explanation.
There were plenty of unknowns in the Project Blue Book files, just as indeed there were unknowns in the Ministry of Defense UFO files, in the UFO files of countries all around the world. Self-evidently, all these unknowns are of some defense and national security concern. One cannot have objects operating in controlled airspace with impunity without this being of interest and indeed concern to people at the highest levels in both government and the Air Force.
Often people say they will not believe in UFOs until they land on the White House lawn. Well, one of the most famous and mysterious Blue Book cases came close. UFO sightings over Washington, D.C. in July 1952 made worldwide headlines and left the U.S. Air Force dazed and confused. The event spanned several days and included multiple radar identifications of unknown craft, some of which were correlated by witnesses on the ground. Many of the sightings caused the Air Force to scramble jet fighters, and in each of these cases, the UFOs outmaneuvered the jets. This all culminated into what may be the most important official U.S. Air Force UFO investigation of all time.
The sightings over Washington, D.C. in July 1952 were extraordinarily important for two reasons. Firstly, they were significant sightings in and of themselves. They were being seen by Air Force personnel, they were being tracked on radar, military jets were being vectored to take a closer look at this. But the second angle is the geopolitical one. Up until this point, I think it was easy for people to write this off, this whole phenomenon, as something of a curiosity. These things are seen perhaps in remote areas, predominantly in the southwestern United States. It's easy to kid yourself perhaps that it's some sort of secret prototype aircraft or missile that another part of the government is testing. But when you bring it to the heart of government, when you literally have these events taking place over the White House, over the Capitol building, it puts the whole thing center stage. This can no longer be ignored, and it wasn't.
The U.S. Air Force's investigation of the events in Washington, D.C. is best explained in a book written by the lead investigator, Captain Edward Ruppelt. Ruppelt, who was the head of the U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation department, Project Blue Book, from its inception in early 1952 until late 1953, published the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects in 1956. The summer of 1952 was a busy time for the Blue Book investigators. Ruppelt referred to this period as the Big Flap. with some of the most credible reports coming from the Washington, D.C. area. On July 10th, a National Airlines crew reported a UFO over nearby Quantico, Virginia. They described the object as too bright to be a lighted balloon and too slow to be a big meteor. Then on July 13th, another commercial airline crew reported a UFO 60 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. The crew was flying at 100,000 feet when they spotted a light below them. The object came up to their level, and when they turned on their headlights, it shot up in a steep climb. The next day, on July 14th, yet another commercial airline crew reported a UFO. This time, it was during a flight from New York to Miami. While flying in the area of Newport News, Virginia, approximately 130 miles south of Washington, D.C., the crew reported seeing 8 UFOs. 2 days later, on the night of July 16th at around 9 p.m., a high-ranking scientist from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Laboratory at Langley Air Force Base reported seeing a UFO with a friend. They were standing near the ocean when they saw 2 amber-colored lights off to their right. The lights were silently moving to the north. The scientist said they were much too large to be aircraft lights. Ruppelt and his investigators had decided that this object would have been too big to be a plane given the description of the lights, and they could not find an answer as to what the scientist and his friend had seen. Ruppelt said it was a moot point, however, because the scientist was a very famous aerodynamicist and of such professional stature that if he said the lights weren't airplanes, they weren't. On July 20th, Ruppelt flew to Washington, D.C. on unrelated business. He landed at Washington National Airport and he grabbed a newspaper to catch up on the latest news. Ruppelt immediately called his superior officer at the Pentagon, Major Dewey Fournet, who told Ruppelt that there was an investigation happening at Bolling Air Force Base. Ruppelt headed there and received a briefing from the intelligence officer. At the meeting, they learned that at 11:40 p.m. the previous night, 7 objects were caught on radar at Washington National Airport. At first, the radar operators thought the objects were a formation of planes, but nothing like that was scheduled. The objects moved slowly at 100 to 130 miles per hour, but then would streak across the scope in sudden bursts of speed. The targets had moved all over the area, including over prohibited areas, such as the airspace over the White House and the U.S. Capitol building. One of the objects was clocked at speeds of more than 7,000 miles per hour. The targets appeared to have flown near commercial airliners, and soon thereafter, pilots were reporting strange lights. The first sighting from a pilot was from a Capital Airlines flight leaving Washington National Airport. The control tower asked the pilots of that plane to keep an eye out for strange lights. During the flight, the pilot yelled, "There's one off to the right, and there it goes." The radar correlated that an object had been tracked on the plane's right side. The pilot reported seeing 6 more lights in the next 15 minutes. Several similar incidents took place that night. However, one of the most notable incidents was when the Washington National Airport traffic controller called the Andrews Air Force Base tower to tell them they were tracking an object south of the base. The tower operators looked out of their windows to see what they described as a huge fiery orange sphere hovering in the sky. At the beginning of the excitement, once the Washington National Airport radar operators had determined their equipment was working properly, they began calling the Air Force to ask them to investigate. However, they didn't receive a response. They called over and over, but the Air Force didn't respond until daybreak the next morning. One interceptor checked out the area, but by then the UFOs were gone. The events and the subsequent press coverage sent the U.S. Air Force into a state of pure confusion, complicated by bureaucratic bumbling. It was decided that Ruppelt would stay in Washington, D.C. to further investigate and formulate a response for the press, who was growing steadily impatient with the Air Force's official no-comment response. However, the Air Force Finance Department would not approve the extension to his stay and sent him home. Back in his office in Dayton, Ohio, Ruppelt says he was too swamped with other UFO sightings to investigate the Washington, D.C. incident. Several of these sightings also included jets being scrambled to check out the UFOs. Then, exactly 1 week after the first major Washington, D.C. event at about 10 p.m., Ruppelt received a call from Life magazine's UFO expert asking what the Air Force was going to do about that night's UFOs. Ruppelt said, I have no idea what the Air Force is doing. In all probability, it's doing nothing. He hadn't heard anything about a new UFO event and guessed no one else in the Air Force had either. He called Air Force intelligence and the Pentagon and found out he was correct. Several people from the Pentagon hurried out to Washington National Airport, including the Air Force's press chief Al Chop, Major Fournet, and a U.S. Navy electronics specialist assigned to the U.S. Air Force Directorate of Intelligence. All of them had a front row seat to the evening's spectacular performance. Ruppelt had to wait until 5 a.m. the next morning to hear what took place. He was told at about 10:30 p.m. that Washington National Airport had once again picked up the slow-moving targets. The objects were in an arc surrounding the Washington, D.C. area. The objects spanned from Herndon, Virginia to Andrews Air Force Base. The same radar operators were present from the prior event, so they were prepared and worked quickly to mark and track the UFOs. They contacted Andrews Air Force Base, who confirmed they were also picking up the objects. At 11:30 p.m., it was decided to call in interceptors to check out the objects. Again, they were slow to respond, but 2 Lockheed F-94 Starfires were in the air by midnight. At this point, reporters and photographers were asked to leave the radar room. Ruppelt says the radar room was cleared because some of the Air Force officers thought this might be the night they got a good up-close look at a UFO. Visibility that night was good. However, when the jets approached the targets, the objects disappeared from the radar screens. The jets returned to their base. However, a few minutes later, strange lights were seen near Langley Air Force Base. The lights were described as rotating and giving off alternating colors. The radar tower operators also saw the lights, so they called in an F-94 jet to check it out. The jet pilot spotted the UFO's lights and began moving towards it when the light disappeared. The pilot continued to fly around the area and achieved a radar lock on the object, but whatever it was sped away. The same thing happened 2 more times. Soon after the events near Langley Air Force Base, objects were again observed above Washington National Airport. Jets were scrambled again, but this time the objects stayed on radar as the jets approached. The tower controllers gave the jets the coordinates of the objects, but each time a jet closed in on the objects, they would speed away. This interaction continued for a few more minutes until one object did not speed off. The F-94 pilot saw a bright light and hit his afterburners to pursue the object. However, as he got closer, the light just disappeared, and he could not get anything on his radar set. The jet stayed in the area for 20 minutes, but finally ran low on fuel and had to return to the base. Dawn began to break, and soon the targets all disappeared. The next day, the press reported that fighter pilot Lieutenant William Patterson said, "I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet, but the radar controllers vectored us around. I saw several bright lights. I was at my maximum speed, but even then I had no closing speed. I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them. I was vectored into new objects. Later, I chased a single bright light, which I estimated about 10 miles away. I lost visual contact with it about 2 miles. Ruppelt was informed that everybody in the radar room was convinced that the targets were very probably caused by solid metallic objects. There had been weather targets on the scope too, he said, but these were common to the Washington area and the controllers were paying no attention to them. The papers were once again packed with headlines about the UFO chase. Ruppelt flew to Washington, and when he got to his hotel, he was mobbed by reporters and photographers. With the help of a colleague, he pushed his way to an elevator without making any comments. According to Ruppelt, the U.S. Air Force was in a state of confusion. They all agreed that the UFO event should be investigated, but no one actually did anything about it. Unable to dodge the public's fascination with the Washington events, on July 29th, Major General Samford notified the press that he would have a press conference on the Washington UFO incidents. Ruppelt felt it a bit odd that none of the men in the radar room at Washington National Airport were involved in the press conference. Instead, the press conference was held by Major General Samford and another officer, neither of whom had been fully briefed.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States. In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States.
Sanford told the press that the UFO investigations had turned out to be mostly misidentifications, but that the other 20% of the reports that came in were from credible observers of relatively incredible things. He said the Air Force would continue to investigate those reports, but they suspect the Washington, D.C. events may have been false radar readings due to temperature inversions. According to Ruppelt, the actual investigation ruled out temperature inversions. In fact, he discovered that every single night of the UFO sightings in Washington, D.C., there was indeed a temperature inversion, but none of these had previously been mistaken for UFOs. Ruppelt also discovered that UFOs were a common occurrence in Washington, D.C. that summer. On May 23rd, from 8 p.m. until midnight, 50 unknown targets had been tracked on radar. There were several similar incidents throughout the summer, including the night of the press conference. As a result, to Ruppelt, the objects could only be designated as unknowns. Alleged pictures and videos of these events can be found on the internet. However, they are all either reflections or recreations of the events. No pictures or video were actually captured, and the cases remain unsolved. Ruppelt says this case convinced many that UFOs were interplanetary spaceships. If the objects over Washington, D.C. in 1952 could not be explained, it seems obvious that an incursion of this sort would pose a threat to national security.
Governments are fond of saying in relation to the UFO phenomenon that the whole issue is of no defense significance, and that's broadly speaking the soundbite that was trotted out to the media and the public with the 1952 UFO flap over Washington, D.C., and indeed with the sightings looked at by Blue Book more generally. However, it's important to say, I think, that this really was just a soundbite for public consumption, a sort of way of calming any fears and concerns about this. Behind closed doors, there's no doubt, and indeed the paper trail shows this, and indeed the testimony from people who were there, like Edward Ruppelt from Project Blue Book, there's no getting away from the fact that this was taken seriously at the highest level, as indeed it should have been. UFOs over the Capitol. This was not something that could be ignored, and it wasn't.
In the government's UFO files, there is a memo that claims the cases that posed a real threat were not included in the Blue Book files, and researchers have been tracking where those cases went. They have discovered that the U.S. Air Force has taken UFO incidents seriously after the closing of Blue Book in 1969, and the cases that made it to this high-level reporting system are even more fascinating and alarming than the events in 1952.
When Project Blue Book was closed, the program was closed by a guy called Brigadier General Carroll H. Bolender. And he wrote a memo, an air staff memo, and it actually stated something really, really curious. In it, on page 2, it stated, moreover, reports of unidentified flying objects which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146 and Air Force Manual 5511 and are not part of the Blue Book system. This is simply saying that we never sent the best stuff to Blue Book. Some good cases got into the Blue Book system, no doubt about it. Some did, but a heck of a lot didn't, and we know that.
We'll take a look at this reporting system and the cases that have prompted its use in the next episode of Open Minds Magazine.